Welcome to the 15th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India at the Jan Mikulski Foundation, Baithak. We are delighted to introduce Bilingualities in many tongues. The session is presented by ABP Live. India is a multilingual nation existing in a constant and ongoing state of translation. Four writers who express themselves with proficiency in more than one language in their literary pursuits speak of how they negotiate the distances between their mother tongues and their learned languages, and how they communicate their creativity in both. In a session of reading and conversation, our speakers speak of their discipline, writing process, and the linguistic and literary worlds they carry within. May we please welcome on stage Akhil Kathyal, who is a Delhi-based writer and translator who has authored many books like Blood on Bitten Tongue, Delhi Poems, and How Many Countries Does the Indus Cross? He has also translated Ravish Kumar's book Ishq Mein Sheher Hona as a city happens in love. Akhil was the International Writing Fellow at the University of Iowa in fall 2016 and was awarded the Vijay Nambisan Poetry Fellowship for the year 2021. Next we have Kunal Basu, who is author of several critically acclaimed novels, including The Miniaturist and Calcutta, and a collection of stories titled The Japanese Wife. His work has widely been translated and nominated for prestigious awards. He has also written novels in Bengali. Anukriti Upadhyay writes fiction and poetry in both Hindi and English. Her works include the twin novellas Dora and Bhauri, a novel Kintsugi, a short story collection titled Japanese Rai, and the novel Nina Auntie. Tanut Solanki is the author of 3 books of fiction. His most recent novel, The Machine is Learning, was longlisted for the JCB Prize for Literature 2020. Tanut's short fiction has been published in The Caravan, The Hindu Business Line, DNA, Out of Print, and several other publications. In 2019, he was awarded the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar for his short story collection, Diwali in Muzaffarpur. The moderators, please. Thank you.
Thank you. A warm hello to everyone in the audience, and a big thank you to JLF for making this happen. The topic for the discussion today is bilingual expression, bilingualities, and we have with us 3 writers. All of them write in at least 2 languages that the world knows of. Akhil writes in English and Hindi, Hindustani, and Kunal in English and Bengali, and Anukriti in English and Hindi. I'm going to start today's discussion with Akhil. Akhil, your book of poems, Like Blood on a Bitten Tongue, it has poems both in Hindi and English. And while reading it, I was thinking about it. This is something not very frequent, in Indian poetry, and one wonders why it is not. And I was curious as to how a poem of yours decides, or you realize that this one needs to be written in English, this one will go in Hindi, and something like that. And also with your work, I felt that, especially like Blood on a Bitten Tongue, it all comes together. They all feel part of a single collection, and that, of course, is the idea. So, I wanted to ask you about what goes into Hindi, what goes into English, how do you decide? Does it come naturally or something,
It's really interesting that you say that, and especially I think we have to mark just the courage of good editors. And V. Karthika at Westland Context was amazing in the sense that she took it on board. That if she saw bilinguality not as, bilinguality not as one of the gimmicks of the book, but bilinguality as something which is constitutive of the work, something which was central to its scheme. And she came on board, like in fact she almost suggested it, that but why are you keeping your Hindi poems out of this scheme? So I was really thankful to her. And as far as the poems themselves are concerned, usually a poem, and there are several writers in the room also I know, usually a poem sort of starts with a kind of a word or a phrase or an image which explains something fundamental to you, which makes the world more lucid to you in some manner or the other. And because the way all of us, I guess, inhabit the world is not through some kind of monochromatic frame, through some monolingual frame, but these sort of different languages which are part of my inheritance, whether they are English, Hindi, Hindustani, Urdu, Punjabi, they have this kind of very, I mean, it's a very unrationalized coexistence. There's not kind of clear hierarchies at work over there. So that word or image or phrase would come in any one of those languages or sometimes a combination of those. So in fact, I thought when Tanuj had spoken to me that we talk about this, there was one a poem that I had thought I'd share with you folks. You know, I was thinking of this poem and the image that had come to me as a starting point for this poem was the idea that forgiveness, but I didn't think of it as a kind of an abstraction, but as something which, it's almost like a concrete object which you can hold in your hand. And this poem I thought I'll just share with you because a month after I found myself translating that poem into Hindi. So I'll share both the poems. Forgiveness. I carry it like a paper-pressed rose, like an old stamp, like a ticket stub to a forgotten show. Whenever I hold it, I am careful that it does not fall to pieces in my hands. One day, you might ask for it. And obviously, this poem is trying to make sense of someone's sudden departure, and obviously, that's something that you make sense of for a long time. So a month later, I found myself translating this poem into Hindi. Maafi. मैं लिए फिरता हूँ किसी किताब में दबे पत्ते की तरह, किसी पुरानी स्टैम्प की तरह, किसी सिनेमा टिकट की तरह जिसका शो अब याद भी नहीं. जब भी उसे हाथों में लेता हूँ, ध्यान देता हूँ कि उंगलियों में कहीं बिखर सी ना जाए. एक दिन कहीं तुम मांग ना लो.
Thank you, Akhil. Coming to you, Kunal, you've been an English writer for a long time, and if one talks about your fiction in Bengali, I think the first novel was published in 2016, right? So one can call it relatively late in your writing journey. And my first curiosity when I learned that was, how do you come to that decision? How do you decide at a certain point that this particular novel or this particular story that I'm thinking of, maybe I should, write it in Bengali? What brings you to that differentiation, that clarity? And I must add that I think after you started, in a very short span, there were four novels. So just tell us about, how did this shift come? It's not that you have stopped writing in English. Your most recent work, In an Ideal World, is in English. So how does this bilingual expression work for you, and what prompted the shift to Bengali, if I may call it that?
Thank you. I don't think my bilingualism is my credit, really. It is the gift of India. I grew up in a specific time in Bengal when two literary streams flowed within us, English and Bengali. And we did not need to seek permission to jump from one to the other. Okay? To my left was Tolstoy, to my right was Tagore. Okay? And so I have always considered myself to be a Bangla writer, although my first Bengali poems, very bad poems, were published when I was in university. Most Bengalis write poems of romance and revolution. I wrote about romance and revolution. Okay. Romance came, revolution never did. Okay. So I had never abandoned the notion of writing in Bangla, although my literary journey had started with English, and I'd written quite a few novels in English. Okay. Now, let me give you a concrete example to your question as to when did I decide that a particular story needs to be written in Bangla or English. So several years ago, a producer from Bombay called me and said, Mr. Basu, we want you to write a story for us, for cinema. And they also prescribed the subject matter. They said, we want you to write a story about trafficking, about human trafficking. And I said, no, I don't write stories to order. So you're calling the wrong person. Okay? After a few days, the thought struck me is, let's not be foolish about this. Because we all know about trafficking, human trafficking. We all are anguished by human trafficking when we read reports in the newspapers. But maybe if I engaged with this project, I will learn more about it. And the selfish motive of the writer played, maybe I'll find a story there. Okay? And so I said, well, can you arrange for me to meet traffickers? Can you arrange for me to meet victims of trafficking who have been rescued? And they said, yes. So I still remember, Tanuj, on one fine morning, we drove down from Kolkata to the Sundarbans. And they took me to this small hut in a decrepit village where rescued victims of trafficking had assembled for me to ask them questions. So I went, equipped with pad and paper and recorder. I was being my writerly self. And inside that hut, there were 14 little girls. I'll call them little girls. Okay? And I couldn't ask them any questions. The sheer primitive barbarism of the situation that they had faced made me speechless. And the 14 pairs of eyes came together to one pair who I called Shabnam in my mind. And thus the story of Tejushwini or Shabnam, Tejashwini and Shabnam, Tejashwini, a CNN reporter, and Shabnam, a trafficked woman from the Sundarbans, meeting in Iraq in the theater of war after the death of Saddam Hussein. So that was my novel. So when my London agent said, and I told her what the story was about, the Bengali story was about, she said, oh, Kunal, why didn't you write this in English? What an interesting global story it would have been about two women, their friendship in different backgrounds in uncertain times. And I said, I couldn't write this, Philippa. Because to your point, when a story is born in my mind, just like a word or an image is born in your mind, it brings with it its penumbra. It brings with it voices, places, and the contextuality of that story at its origin suggests to me whether I should write it in Bangla or in English.
Thank you, Kunal. Anukriti, I have a similar question for you. You have, in the last few years, published 3 novels in English, Dora, Bhauri, and Kintsugi. And you have also published 2 books in Hindi, a short story collection, and a novel. And my question is, when you write in these 2 languages, what are the differences in your mental processes, even your writing regimen, or your style, when you're operating in these 2 languages? What are the things that you're conscious of, that these differences exist? And what are the things that you have discovered? Maybe readers have told you, come up to you saying, आपका हिंदी का काम हमें ऐसा है, ऐसा लगा, आप हिंदी में ऐसा करते हैं, and in English you do something like that. I'm sure some readers have read both your work in both languages and have come up to you. So I was curious about 2 things, therefore. What are the differences for you between the 2 languages as a creator? And what have you learned in the process of creating in these 2 languages?
Thank you, Tanuj. This is a very thoughtful question. I expected nothing less from a very fine writer and thoughtful reader like you. So it goes without saying, the 2 languages have very different textures and feel. And I feel it in my diaphragm, in my sound box. Now I'm speaking in English. I can feel my voice in my throat. अब मैं हिंदी में बोल रही हूँ और मुझे पता है छाती से आवाज़ आ रही है, ना भी गोहर से आवाज़ आ रही है. जो ये अनुभूतियाँ हैं भिन्न भाषाओं की, ये सिर्फ भाषा या स्वर की नहीं, ये आपके शरीर, आपकी जहाँ पर आपका मूल है, जिसको मूलाधार चक्र बोलते हैं योग में, वहाँ तक आप महसूस सकते हैं. इसलिए जो जागृत हैं शब्द, वो शब्द आपको कहीं गहरे तक छूते हैं. You can feel the vibration. Everything is, when you reduce it, you are a science student, I'm not. But in my own quirky poetic way, I believe everything can be reduced to vibrations. And language is the ultimate vibration. It conveys meaning, it conveys everything else along with it. So Hindi is my mother tongue, and English is my acquired mother, a mother I chose to adopt, or a mother that was, I hate to use this word because it sounds so forced, but it was forced. So a mother who's been foisted upon me and on many of us through our colonial traditions and where we find ourselves in the history of our nation. So I learned English the same way I guess most of us did, through school, and I read I read across languages from a very, very early age. However, I did not start speaking English on a regular basis till I joined the professional course. Till then, and that was in my early 20s, and my professional life is when I actually started speaking in English. Till then, I always spoke in Hindi. And therefore, I wrote in Hindi. I wrote mainly poetry, and all my poetry was in Hindi. Then prose just came in English because my work was prosaic. That was the language of the universe I chose to enter for various reasons. And that language became the more convenient one for prose. So in that way, I did not choose from my volition, by my own volition. That was just how the compartmentalization worked. But unlike Kunal, for whom most stories originate in certain language, for me, all prose stories are just English. Till a very respected publishing house, Raj Kamal's publisher, Ashok Maheshwariji, said, why don't you also write prose in Hindi? And so, by habit of obedience, which I have tried all my life to unlearn and not succeeded, I wrote my first story in Hindi. This was in 2018. I guess you've read some of those. I wrote 2 stories, and another publisher, a very respected publisher, Meera Johri ji of Rajpal, read them and wrote to me saying, we want to bring out a collection. I had written 2 stories in Hindi. Those were my sole prose work in Hindi. I was deeply touched that somebody felt I could do a collection. And that's how I arrived to Hindi prose. And I'm deeply grateful that I did, that people pointed me to it, because the language means, in many ways, more to me than English does. I'm not denying that my English works, as you know, have been read more. Kintsugi won a Best Fiction Award. People read them more and they come to me saying how it has touched them. My Hindi works, unfortunately, have not been read more. But that language means the world that I inhabit in my head. In fact, I will steal a leaf from Akhil's book and read a very short, just like 6 lines, of what the language means to me, which I only discovered now. After all these years, this is what Hindi means to me. This is to my language. मेरी गुदड़ी की लाल, मेरी मिट्टी का ढेल, मेरी लकड़ी, नून, तेल, मेरा घर, छप्पर, छावनी, सिरहाना, पैताना, पोतड़े, चुनरी, कफन, मेरी दुखती रग, मेरी भाषा. मैं तुम्हारी सौंधी सांवली छाह में बैठ लोहे के चने चावना चाहती हूँ. तुम्हें अपनी कंटीली कमज़ोर बाहों में भरकर झकझोर देना चाहती हूँ. मेरी भाषा, मैं तुम्हें जागना चाहती हूँ. I want to awaken in my own language. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Anukriti. Yeah, it does wonderfully. Coming to you, Akhil. You've translated Ravish Kumar's very popular Ishq Mein Sheher Hona. You're a translator. And you have also translated poems by Agha Shahid Ali and Elizabeth Bishop, and I'm sure others as well. So I was curious about how this, and you read a translation, in response to my first question of your own work, right? So I was curious about how this act of translation informs your bilingual expression. Do you feel this impulse that I should translate all my poems in English into Hindi one day, or vice versa? Uh, or it is an act of selection in itself, that one chooses what to translate. And overall, the act of translation from English to Hindi, Hindustani, or in the other direction, how does it inform your own creative expression?
That's a great question. I mean, one of the things that translation seemed the obvious thing to do, because all of us, at least in this part of the world, are instinctively bilingual, if not tri or tetra or like multilingual. So it's just that when you live in Delhi or any other part of this world, your world you're constantly processing, your blueprint for the world is necessarily multilingual. So there are writers who I admire and who I was like standing and like fangirling over, and translation was a way to sort of pay tribute, but also like become a footnote in their life somewhere. So translation started from that impulse. But the thing about translation is, translation, I mean, yesterday also in several other panels this came up, that translation is obviously a very close form of reading. Like you have to come to terms with the conventions, the canons, all the meaning-making capacities of any language. The shape of words, and their contextual location. So it just makes you into a very kind of keen reader. And also when you do your own original compositions, having gone through that process of translation, your words are also hopefully more sharpened and chiseled for that reason. So translation in that sense, I mean, whether it's sort of translating kind of macabre, kind of black humor of Dorothy Parker, or this kind of excessive ache and longing in Aga Shahid Ali's stationery, or just kind of images in Langston Hughes's Harlem, is a process which sharpens your own language. So I thought, again, maybe I could read a poem which I think all of you would know. It's a poem by Langston Hughes called Harlem. It's a poem which, the only where it grounds you is in the title, because the rest, what follows, is just one image in a kind of synaptic relation with another image. So I'll read out the Hindi translation and then his original. Harlem, Langston Hughes. एक अधूरे सपने का क्या होता है? एक अधूरे सपने का क्या होता है? क्या वो सूख जाता है धूप में किशमिश की तरह, या किसी खुले घाव की तरह पस से भरा पकता है? क्या वो सड़े हुए मांस सा बदबदाता है, या पपड़ी बन जाता है पुरानी चाशनी की तरह? शायद चुपचाप किसी भारी बोझ की तरह वो लटकता है, या बम सा फटता है? Harlem, Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? This is Langston Hughes.
Thank you, Akhil. I recently read a series of novels by Chester Himes. It's called the Harlem Cycle. So if you're interested in more Harlem, I think you could go to fiction as well and see if you can translate that. I'm actually coming to Kunal and Anukriti, for the next question. India is a multilingual country, of course, but books tend to be created and books tend to remain in one language, and especially for myself as well as a writer in English. Writing or setting a story in a multilingual reality, but writing it in one language involves an act of translation, right? There is this implicit translation. For example, some of your characters actually are doing their business in Hindi or in any other Indian language, but since you're writing the book in English, you have to translate their words. When I do that, my tendency is to try to hide the translation in the sense that let the reader not become very explicitly aware of the fact that there is a translation. So I wanted to come to you, Kunal, and this is the same question to both Kunal and Anukriti. This implicit translation, that especially in Indian writing in English, and I'm sure in other languages as well, because the realities that we depict in our fictions operate in multiple languages, while our fictions come out in a single one. And unlike Akhil's book of poems, which would have 3 poems in English, then 2 in Hindi, I think in fiction you don't see literal bilingualism inside the works. So how do you tackle that problem? And I'm very consciously calling it a problem, Kunal. So.
I've written novels that are not set in India. I've written Victorian novels where all the characters speak in English. I've written novels that are set in Lisbon, in Portugal, or in China. Quite a few novels set in China where they don't speak in English, nor do they speak any Indian languages. But let me answer that question by giving an example. So in 2002, I was writing this novel called The Miniaturist. It's a novel which is set in the court of Emperor Akbar. It's a story of a young artist, a delinquent artist. And in his delinquency, he paints a portfolio of work which is considered to be blasphemous. And he's thrown out of Akbar's Hindustan. And he goes traveling northwestward through and ultimately ends his journey in eastern Turkey. When I was writing this novel, I had this chat in Bangalore with my very good friend Ramchandra Guha. So Ram said, Kunal, how are you going to write dialogue for these Mughals? Because these Mughals didn't speak Urdu, they spoke in Chuktai Turk. Okay, I don't know any Chuktai Turk. I don't know the incantations of that language. Okay, and to your point, my response was, when I write fiction, which is quite global, which is not only located in India, but in many different parts of the world, I don't see it as a problem. I see it as and the excitement of finding the essential dialogue. See, a father, when he's angry with his son for not studying, would say, you spend all your time flying kites. When will you study? Okay? Now, in this 15th century, a Mughal artist will admonish his son by saying, you only fly kites. When are you going to paint? Okay? And in the 21st century, a Bengali father or a mother would say, you only do WhatsApp. You're only on social media. When are you going to study? That is essential dialogue. Okay? So my search as a novelist is to understand the essential dialogues in situations that can be very varied in time and space. I'm not saying I always succeed. I could fail. But if I succeed, they will sound authentic to that context.
Thank you, Kunal. The same question to you, Anukriti, but just a slight addition there. Because I know from your work, the collection of stories in Hindi, Japani Sarai, it has a story where a woman and a Japanese man are interacting or having a conversation in a bar in Tokyo. That story is in Hindi. And one presumes that, the conversation is in English, but again, there is an implicit translation, you present it in Hindi. Likewise, in your novels Dora and Bhauri, and even in Kintsugi, one imagines that some of the action is originally happening in some other language brought to English. So how do you tackle this implicit translation in your works?
So, like Kunal, Kintsugi's world spans geographies. Jaipur, Japan, Borneo, Singapore, travels all over the world. To write for those characters, some of them not Indian, it was interesting because I have a great love for Japan. And the Japanese characters were really organic. I have interacted with Japanese people. There's a osmosis happens when you talk to people, you sort of fall into the cadence, or I don't know, it happens with me a lot. You fall into the cadence of their language. You try to imitate how they speak in order to communicate. So oftentimes if you and it happens in professional world, is, when we are trying to talk to non-Indian people, our voice inflection changes, and we try to adopt an accent so they can hear, they can understand. And it happened a lot to me when I interacted with Japanese people. Their mannerisms, the way they handle language and their own bodies when they are talking, it just seeped in. And when I wrote Yuri or Haruko, it was very natural. Where I struggled was when I wrote the American character, because that was an unknown world. It's such a young civilization. They are such action-oriented and living in the moment people, whereas I am a very shy introvert, and I live in the past often, or at least I try to. So that was a bit of a challenge. However, the Rajasthani or the Jaipur-based characters, again, because in Dora and Bhauri, what I had done was, I never even thought, I consciously suppressed the thought that Bhauri is a Gadolia Lohar nomadic woman. And her life experiences are vastly different to my own. I tried to consciously suppress that thought so that she could live, and Anukriti is of no material importance. In the process, I'm a medium, as you know, writers are mediums, things pass through them. So for those Dora and Bhauri, there are so many Rajasthani words, because that's how Bhauri and the characters of Dora, the nomads and the petty bureaucrats, thought. And those words came in, and I'm so grateful to my editor, I don't know whether he's here or not, Rahul Soni of HarperCollins, who actually did not redact even a single word. In fact, he encouraged me and he said, yeah, go for it. It preserves it helps, address the challenge that you were saying. How do you make a person speak a language that they never speak? You just carry the cadence of their language, and if the words come organically from that language, you just let them come in. And in fact, he told me we should not have a glossary, because the context and the story clarifies the words, and it deepens engagement if you do not have a glossary. So I guess it's not a very intelligent answer I'm giving to you, but the fact is, some of it I absorbed, some of it I allowed, and the rest of it you will discover that it's forced.
So one other curiosity I've had is that, and this is again a question to all three of you, are there modes in which you are operating in one language and then you have to shift to the other? Like, for example, are there physical or temporal distinctions that you have to make? अगले 3 महीने मैं हिंदी में काम कर रहा हूँ, उसके बाद मैं 6 महीने I'll work in English. Does it happen like that? And I imagine it might be different for you, Akhil, when you're writing poems versus Kunal and Anukriti when they're writing fiction, which tends to be a longer term, process. So starting with you, Akhil, how does it, how does it operate? How does it shift for you?
So it's easier in poetry in the sense that because it's certainly a shorter form than even short fiction or certainly long fiction, that those leaps and somersaults sort of between languages is more possible. But I went to one of these kind of crazy colonial schools, of which I know some folks are sitting in the audience as well, in Lucknow. And it was one of those schools where you were caned for not speaking in English and made to stand in the corner facing the wall. And meanwhile, we were getting a kind of a subliminal training in the hierarchy of languages that's in our house, where my parents would speak to each other in Punjabi, but with us, they would either speak in Hindi, and which is peppered with like English words. So they would say, botal nahi bolo, bottle bolo, chawal nahi bolo, rice bolo. And so almost as if the initial training was in this kind of, the fact that we had a stuttering grasp of Hindi was a matter of pride, not of shame. And it was only in kind of once I joined college, Delhi University, that I had to unlearn all that business at some point. And during my PhD, when I was reading like Ismat Chughtai or Nirala or Amarkant or Kamleshwar, like there was a way in which you return to several languages which you already had. which you sort of, your school had sort of forced you to forget. But I found that because of that gap, I found that, kind of a more playful, satirical, or humorous mode or register is there when you are writing in Hindi, at least in the initial phases of my work, and something which was more emotionally resonant or demanding, conceptually more rigorous, something that I was trying out in English. But that's because the school had created, instead of a fullness of learning, that it created a gap in learning. So that's something that I find myself thinking about. So, when I'm writing in Hindi, like I'm writing more in the spoken idiom, because even as they were like training us in English, and my school had no business doing that. It was founded by a French soldier who defected from the French army when the French started losing and the British started winning. So, even as we were trained into English, my father was taking me to like Hasya Kavi Sammelans in Lucknow, and there was obviously the cinema of the 90s, which was like this ever-present thing. So when I wrote in Hindi, I saw that like more spoken idiom, like the voice of like brokers and the voice of the Hasya Sammelan Kavis, and the voice of my local barber, or the voice of conversation with an old partner. Like it's the spoken idiom which works there, and whereas in the English, it's a kind of a voice of very tortured interiority at work. So that seems to be the division of labor. It's very strange, but that seems to be the division of labor, but that had crept in the early phases. Now it's blurring a bit as you return to Hindi in a more sturdy manner.
And for you, Kunal, do you shift between modes? When you're working in Bengali, do you have to take away the English books from your desk and surround yourself with that?
We are running out of time, so I'm going to be very brief. Okay? There is no physical separation. All my 4 Bengali novels were written in my Oxford study, and my most recent English novel was written in my Kolkata study. Okay? So there is no obvious separation, but the separation happens in a different way. When I prepare for a novel, I try to identify the novel with certain kinds of music or with certain kinds of food, okay, and things like that. So I'll just give you one hilarious example, and I'll pass on. Is when I was writing The Miniaturist, the novel that I spoke about, my biggest problem was, how do I physically go back to the 15th century? The Mughal harems, no man was allowed to go in. How can I make that imaginative leap and understand what happens inside a Mughal harem? Okay? So there were a lot of bridges for me to cross, but there was one bridge which was easier to cross, which is Mughlai Khana. Okay? So for 1 year, when I was researching and writing this novel, we laid out food on the carpet. We listened to Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, okay, and we ate a lot of Mughlai food. And the real problem was I put on weight, a weight that I'm ever since then trying to lose. Thank you.
I'll also answer quickly. Unfortunately, I have no exciting answer like Kunal. As a full-time working professional and a mother of a young child and a woman playing 20 roles, I just felt very privileged that I had time to write. For me, both languages, whichever language was at the moment at the forefront, it was the one getting written. Longer works, yes, I tended to stick to, so short stories I wrote in either language fluidly. Longer works, I stuck to one language. However, poetry always intervened. I translated my own poetry just to stimulate my own sort of creative nerves, but that's about it.
We can open to audience questions if the audience has, please. I think there are a lot of hands.
Namaskar panel, I'm Malvika. My question is to Kunal sir. Sir, I'm a big fan, and I just wanted to ask what was the idea behind writing your story, The Japanese Wife?
Oh, we have to go to the author's lounge then, because
Okay.
then I can tell you in a lot of detail. Brief
I'd love
answer,
to.
because I know there are other people.
I'd love to. Thank you.
Brief answer. So I encountered a gentleman, a school teacher, in the Sundarbans many, many years ago, when I was committed to the cause of the revolution. I was not committed to the cause of literature. And a friend pointed out this gentleman and said, "See that guy? He was our school teacher. He has a Japanese wife." Now, in big Indian cities, you would expect people to have foreign spouses, but not in the Sundarbans, And that too Japanese. But to my great good fortune, I did not ask any follow-up questions. How did they meet? You know, do they speak Japanese? And such is the strangeness of the human mind that 30 years later, on a night of snowstorm in Montreal, where I then lived, I sat at my desk and wrote The Japanese Wife.
My name is Srinivas Deshpande. I'm from Karnataka. Kuvempu, you have heard about Kuvempu from Karnataka. He's a very Rashtrakavi. When he started writing in his poems in English, his professor was suggested at that time, please write in your mother tongue, because as rightly Anukriti has rightly pointed out, we think in our language, we feel in our language, and we exhibit in our language. He suggested that accordingly, Anantmurti, Karnad, and even for that matter, Tejasvi, those Lankesh, they all started, earlier they started in writing in English. They switched out to Kannada. The Kannada has benefited much by them. Definitely you can translate it into another language. Writing in two languages, it is batting with left hand as well as right hand. How you people manage that? Either when you think about Bengali, English will creep in, or when you think in English, when you think in Oxford, your Bengali will creep in that. How you manage, how you bridge between that? That's my question.
Sorry, I think the gentleman to my right and the lady to my left would probably be better suited. I can provide you an answer with that, but maybe we can postpone that till after the session. So we do. I'm looking at 0000. Okay, all right. Very fortunately, I have not let the two languages one supersede the other. Okay? And again, this is not because of me. This is my gift of India to me. It has given me multiple languages. मेरा हिंदी बहुत खराब है. मैं कोशिश करूँगा अगर ये जयपुर लिटरेरी फेस्टिवल का मंच में आके हिंदी में उसी की तरफ कुछ कविता आपको सुनाएंगे. But if only I could read and speak in other languages, it would be a tremendous personal gain to me. So for me, there is no hierarchy of language.
नमस्कार मंचासीन सभी प्रबुद्ध विद्वानों को. अनुकृति से मेरा प्रश्न है. अनुकृति बीइंग ए मदर, बीइंग ए डॉटर, आप बहुत अच्छा प्राउड फील करवाती हैं हमें. एक प्रश्न है, मेरी पीड़ा है वो. मेरा ग्रैंडसन अमेरिका रहता है, 5 वर्षीय बालक है. मैं संस्कृत में पीएचडी हूँ. मेरी अंग्रेजी बिल्कुल अच्छी नहीं है. अंग्रेजी बोलती हूँ लेकिन पहले अंदर मन में सोचती हूँ, फिर उसको ट्रांसलेट करके फिर मैं इंग्लिश में बात करती हूँ. पहले अपना अंदर ही वाक्य बना लेती हूँ, उसमें कई बार ग्रामेटिकल मिस्टेक भी होती है. वो 5 साल के बच्चे से जब मैं रोज़ सुबह उसका सुबह शाम वीडियो चैट करती हूँ, तो मैं कोशिश करती हूँ मैं पूरी टाइम से हिंदी में बात करती हूँ. वो नाराज़ होता है, नानी आई डोंट लाइक हिंदी. मैंने कहा भाई तेरी माँ यहाँ हिंदुस्तान की रही हुई है, तू अभी वहाँ का सिटीजन है. तो मेरे को लगता है कि किस तरह से हम बच्चों को प्रमोट करें. वो हमारे हिंदुस्तानी बच्चे हैं और बहुत पीड़ा देते हैं यदि वो बच्चे हमसे हिंदी में बात नहीं करें. हम तो अपनी अभिव्यक्ति उनको समझा देते हैं, लेकिन वो हमारी अभिव्यक्ति को इतने अच्छे से नहीं. मैं कोशिश करती हूँ 2-4 शब्द तो उससे बोलने ही पड़ते हैं मुझे उसको चार्ज करने के लिए. तो उसको लगता है यस मैं कंफर्टेबल अपनी नानी से बात करने के लिए. इसका कोई समाधान होना चाहिए. दूसरा प्रश्न, भाषा के लिए जो मैं कहना चाहूँगी, हम लोग एक ईमानदारी, पूजा जी खड़े हुई है, अनुकृति की मदर हैं, हम लोग ऑनेस्टी के पर एक काम करें. ऑनेस्टी इज़ द बेस्ट पॉलिसी. तो क्या हमें भाषा के प्रति ईमानदार नहीं होना चाहिए? बच्चे आजकल जो एब्यूज़ करते हैं, गालियाँ देते हैं, वो कहीं भी मान्यता प्राप्त नहीं है. उससे वो गुस्सा होते हैं, उसी से अपराध जनरेट होते हैं. तो मेरे को लगता है अहिंसा के लिए एक भाषा, ईमानदारी के लिए अपनी भाषा होनी चाहिए और एक समृद्ध और सुंदर भाषा होनी चाहिए जिसमें वो अपने प्रेम को प्रकट कर सके बजाय अपनी नफरत को. थैंक यू.
बच्चों को कैसे भाषा सिखाई जाए, ये एक दुनिया भर का प्रश्न है. हमारी भाषा जीवित तभी रहेगी जब हम वो आने वाली पीढ़ियों तक पहुंचा दें. ये संघर्ष आप करती रहें, मैं करती रहूं. यहाँ जितने भी लोग बैठे हैं, और सिर्फ हिंदी के लिए नहीं है, हर भाषा के लिए. भाषाओं की श्रेणियाँ नहीं हैं, जैसे अखिल कह रहे थे, हायरार्कीज़ नहीं हैं, हमने बना दी हैं. क्यों हिंदी या बांग्ला या कन्नड़ा या जो भी भाषा है जिसमें आप मूल रूप से जो आपकी नाड़ियों में बह रही है, जो आपके नाड़ी तंत्र को झंकार की तरह हिला देती है, वो भाषा क्यों पीछे हो और क्यों अंग्रेज़ी या दूसरी भाषाएं आगे हो? ये मिला जुला प्रयत्न है। ईमानदारी और बेईमानी की बात नहीं, भाषाओं की श्रेणियाँ नहीं। जो भाषा आप जानते हैं वो आपकी भाषा है, लेकिन उसको मत भूलें जो आपके पूर्वजों की भाषा है, क्योंकि वो भाषा आपकी संस्कृति, आपके इतिहास, आपकी कहानियों, आपकी मूल अस्तित्व का कोश है। वो कोश खो गया तो आप अधूरे रह जाएंगे, आप छीज जाएंगे। आपको पता भी नहीं चलेगा कि आपका कैसे क्षय हुआ है, आपको कैसे हानि पहुंचाई गई है, आपको कैसे लूट लिया गया है। उस कोश को बचाए रखें, वो बच्चे हों, बड़े हों, किसी भी उम्र के हों, भाषा को बचाए रखें।
Can I ask you? This question is addressed to Mr. Akhil. You said you had studied in Lucknow. So I was wondering whether at any point of time did you think of translating some Urdu work into English? Because that's supposed to be vanishing culture now, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
The Urdu...
I recently translated a ghazal by Wajid Ali Shah into English, and I was very kicked about it because I was able to retain the radif and the kafiya as from the original Urdu. वो मुझे अगर याद रहती पूरी दुरुस्त तरीके से तो मैं आपको ज़रूर सुनाता, लेकिन फिर कभी translation from his original Urdu into English. But you know, the Urdu has played a very strange role in my life, because my grandparents, who were from Pakistan, Punjab, they all wrote in Urdu. My nana could read in Urdu, my dadi could read in Urdu. But there is a way in which there was systematic invisibilization of Urdu in Indian classrooms now, where also it is given only one particular religious color, as if Urdu is only the language of Muslims. But however, this only very recently that regret was sort of reversed. One of my students, Abdur, at a university where I used to teach, he over 8 lessons sort of taught me the language of my own grandparents. So now I can बहुत धीरे से जोड़ के, लेकिन अब मैं पढ़ लेता हूँ, और that suddenly opens an entire universe for you because you can read so much more. The only thing about so now that one is conversant with the language, not just as bolchal ki bhasha mein, but textually as well, one will find oneself attempting more translations.
Coming to the, it's now being invisibilized, the Urdu language. Recently, there was a translation of Urdu film magazines in a book, Ye Un Dono Ki Yaadein Hain, by some Mr. Yasir Abbasi, who, translated all the film stories of Shama and Gulfam film magazines into English. Again, as you said rightly, the few words they could not find in translation.
And Urdu, precisely because it has been vilifying of Urdu has been part of religious polarization, in which we live in the welter of that religious polarization now. I mean, the way Urdu, for instance, is treated in the state assembly in UP, or in an artist in Delhi, East Delhi, would be doing a graffiti in Urdu and writing a couplet from Mir or Ghalib, and suddenly these Hindu vigilante groups would sort of land up and say, "Is bhasha ko hatao." मतलब आप उर्दू में राम भी लिख दोगे तो उन लोगों को परेशानी होगी. तो इसलिए the fact that communal polarization is happening to languages is deeply, deeply disturbing. Just one thing I wanted to add about English is कि एक तरह से तो हाँ सारी भाषाएं समान हैं. There's nothing imminent in any language which determines its sort of expressive capabilities. But one thing, I mean, there is a kind of a very sturdy Ambedkarite tradition which says that there is a way in which English has been deeply significant to the subcontinent because it was a language which was not steeped into caste. तो ये महाजन या कत्याल या उपाध्याय या शर्मा या सब नामों में जात है, लेकिन एक टॉमस में जात शायद नहीं है. तो वो अम्बेडकराइट ट्रेडिशन है जो बड़ा स्ट्रॉन्ग ट्रेडिशन है, which actually systematically prefers English over other languages because it was both social mobility for folks who had been systematically oppressed in the subcontinent, and English was a kind of both aspiration and finally a step out of this caste mores. Which is why you find Ambedkar's work, like some of the most resonant work, is very much in English, and it travels both in English and in several other languages. So वो तो एक अंग्रेजी का वो महत्व है सब कॉन्टिनेंट में जो बहुत ज़रूरी चीज़ है.
We can perhaps squeeze one last
Hi.
question. Do
Sorry.
we have time? Yes, yes.
Can I? Yeah. Hi, guys. My name is Jafar. Great session. So something similar has been asked, but this is about emotions. So I speak many languages, and when I switch, I find it really frustrating that I can't really invoke a particular emotion. So when you write, do you feel frustrated sometime that, I really do not have that word for this emotion in this language? And do you feel that, and what do you do that to sort of compensate for that?
Yeah, well, I'm the right person to answer this question because I feel frustrated many times. What I do is I try to use, local words have no translation. A lot of words actually have no translation. Yesterday I was talking to Karuna Izara Parekh and I said, you have got a personality that I can only describe as madhur. There is no translation for madhur. It's not sweet, it's not rhythmic, it's not, what is it? Madhur. Madhur is, it is what it is. So yes, it challenges you, it pushes your boundaries, makes you more alive. That frustration is good frustration.
I think one last question from the... Yeah.
Thank you so much. Am I audible? So I am working as a librarian. I'm trying to bring back reading as a passion in children because, like you mentioned, WhatsApp करते हैं, kite नहीं उड़ा रहे हैं, portraits नहीं बना रहे हैं, कुछ नहीं. That is a very big problem. So we have writers and readers, हमारी generation, हमारी age के हैं, but the young generation is not reading enough. So you as a bilingual writers and readers, what worked for you when you were young? Which got you into reading, and what would you suggest me or recommend me as a librarian that do you think I should have more focus to get children into reading into language, the regional language, or the English, which is the global language? I hope I got it clear, the question. So where should be the focus? I'm so sorry. So where should be the focus? Should I focus more on the regional content to get the children into the reading habit and passion more? Or should I work towards the global English language to get them into reading more?
I personally don't think that external categorizations work. I think we authors have a role to play. If we write absolutely exciting stuff that you cannot put down, then you will read and the students and the kids will read too. It is not enough to berate people and say, oh, you're doing social media, you're not reading. The famous lines of V.S. Naipaul in the beginning of A Bend in the River, the world is the way it is. Okay? And if you want to change the world the way it is, then it's up to us authors to write stuff which are unputdownable, which are fascinating. So you don't have to make it a rule that 15 minutes in this session you must read regional stuff, or you must read, and only then you're allowed to play with your phone. So complex question, and I don't think we can provide a simple answer to it. But what I'm taking away as an author is saying, it is up to me to sway your mind. Okay.
Can I just add one sentence to it? As a mother of a child who now reads voraciously across languages, and reads more than me. What really helped was to just have as many books as possible within easy reach. Do not force them, as Kunal was saying. If it interests them, they will pick it up. However, availability is a must. So your responsibility as a librarian is great. Make all good, interesting content available. It's not important for children whether they read good literature or bad literature. Those are judgments for other people. For children, what interests them? It's just, first step is the reading habit. Just get as many interesting books as you can and talk about books. Make them excited. Make book clubs, make them feel important if they read books. Give them prizes. That's what I did with my little one, manipulated him.
I got into trouble with a journalist once, and who once said, well, what can you authors do? I said, we can do a lot. We can increase the sex appeal of literature.